If you need help picking a deck for a League Cup or a League Challenge this weekend,
Good news, everyone!
then this video is for you. Hey, Nick of 9 Card TCG, and today we're looking at the meta share and meta breakdown for this early May, and it's really just to be a guide to help you pick a deck and prepare for League Cups, regional, whatever you're doing this weekend. So all of the information from this video is brought to us by Trainer Hill. It's an incredible website and they do amazing work, so please go check them out. I have a link in the video description. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. So here we are, Trainer Hill, and I want to start off by showing the parameters I set for the information. Standard format, at least 20 players with a start date of April 21st up until today, May 3rd, run by all organizers. So that's what we're working with right here. And you can see we have two different metagame breakdowns. We have the one on the left, which is overall, and the one on the right, which is the past 7 days. There's really not a ton of difference between the past 2 weeks, the overall, and the last week on the right. So maybe a deck or two here or there slides around a little bit. Honestly, for the most part, it's pretty similar, especially in the top, 5, top 8, and those are the decks that we really want to care about. But what I definitely want to bring your attention to is not only what's being played, but what's winning. So if we choose this placement box and we choose winner, oh my god, Lost Zone becomes 33%, 1/3 of the match of the games or the tournaments won are from Lost Zone decks in the past week, and in the past 2 weeks it's 20%. So that's a huge amount of tournaments being won by Lost Zone decks. So when we start to look at something like the meta game or like the matchup data, Lost Zone decks is something you definitely want to pay attention to. But otherwise, after Lost Zone decks and Gardevoir, everything else is pretty similar. Lost Zone, Gardevoir, Arceus, Duraludon, Goodra. Like, after that, it's like, okay, we really just need to be able to deal with Lost Zone and Gardevoir, and then after that, everything else becomes a little bit more manageable and pretty even, honestly. I want to show a few different skeleton lists for some of the most popular decks, and we're going to start with Gardevoir. It has a core deck list of 58 cards, which means if you take everything you see on the left here, you have 2 available spots to add some text, and I think the texts are kind of important. You can see in the other common cards the text being Mimikyu and Escape Rope. Those are pretty important to help deal with things like the Sableye nonsense, the Lost Origin Sableye that says you can't retreat, and during your next turn you take 90 extra damage. It's also important for something like Alolan Vulpix, which is a major problem for a deck like this. Even something like Flying Pikachu VMAX, if it becomes the only, you don't have a lot of gusting options, you don't have a lot of mobility options, so Flying Pikachu VMAX can also be a really annoying thing to deal with. And by having something like the Mimikyu or the Escape Rope, they can make it a little bit easier for you, the Escape Rope especially, so something to keep in mind there. But for the most part, the deck is kind of, I don't want to say solved, but it's this is what most people are playing, right? Well, a lot of people are copying towards EUIC finalist list and just running that, again, maybe with a couple of cards difference here or there. You can see that something like Arven is another really nice tech card to help go ahead and find something like Forest Seal Stone and another item. It's a really good way to find rare candy very, very early in the game. Avery is a nice way of dealing with things like Lost Zone decks. It's a really nice way of dealing with mirror matches. So again, some of these tech cards I think are really good additions, but for the most part, you're playing a very similar list. So if you do encounter the mirror, you'll have a really good idea of what they have in their deck, because so many of them are very similar. So while that's good, it's also bad, because that means your opponent also knows what you're going to be playing against. Even if they're not playing Gardevoir, you just by virtue of knowing about the deck and having played it a handful of times, you kind of know what most decks have, and they don't have a ton of space for text. So if they do throw in Escape Rope, or they do throw in that Mimikyu game 1 and you see it, then you probably know that's all they got, and you can either play around it or just expect it and plan accordingly. So something to consider when decks become this tight in space. It's good and bad. It's really, really good if you are playing against it, but it can be a little bit of a detriment if you know your opponent is prepared and they know what you're going to be doing. So keep that in mind. But overall, it's a really good deck. It's not one that I personally like to play. It's just not for me. But hey, a lot of people really do like it. So and you're gonna see it. It's new. It's fast. Damage ramps. You're gonna see it. So know the deck, right? Even if you're not playing, you should know. You should know what's gonna be in this. Lost Zone decks are a little bit more fluid with the core card list of 54 cards. The counts can be a little bit different, but for the most, I mean, honestly, for the most part, these decks are playing the same quantities of cards. It's just what they have in there might be a little different from deck to deck. Some of them, most of them are going to be running something like the Raikou. So if you are playing, say, a Lugia deck or something that might, you know, not want to deal with the Raikou opposing Vs, you can hit for 220 pretty easily. Something to keep in mind, almost all of them, 75% of them are playing something like Raikou. It's also really good to know because you know somewhere in there is a 2-prizer, and you can at least expect it. If you're playing Mew, most of them are playing something like a Drapion. Again, I would expect a Drapion in a Lost Zone deck. Whether or not they're playing Dragonite's a different story. I don't want to say it's solved, but when you go against Lost Zone decks, you know what to expect. Expect a Raikou. I would expect a Drapion and maybe even something like a Dragonite. Maybe not all 3, but definitely 2, right? And so depending on what you're playing, if you're playing something like a Mew deck, definitely be prepared and play around that Drapion to the best of your ability. If you're playing Lugia or you're playing Flying Pikachu, be prepared and ready for the Dragonite and for the Raikou. But honestly, these decks, they run really similar cards in terms of quantity. So again, it's one of those decks that it's very well known at this point, and I really don't have too much to say on it other than just kind of know it. The energy counts might be something that you pay special attention to, especially with these Mirage Gate builds. This is definitely the more popular style Lost Zone deck. So when you're playing, just the biggest advice I can give you is keep an eye on something like their energy counts. If you happen to see something like a Forest Seal Stone, then you know they're playing at least 1 Pokemon V. I would expect 2. Sky Seal Stone's the same thing. Your Mew VMAX may get hit really hard with the Drapion. They take 4 prizes, and then all they have to do is boss up a Genesect to knock it out with something like the Raikou or the Dragonite, and that's the game right there. It doesn't have to be much more than that. So if you are playing Mew, Judge Path is really, really annoying for something like this. It turns off their Greninja, it turns off their Drapion. And those are the 2 things that you really have to worry about the most. But otherwise, the challenge of Lost Zone decks is that they can do so many different things, and it's so easy for them to just throw in a one-of card. And if you notice, this version of Lost Zone deck, it doesn't really play the Mawile. So if you are Gardevoir, you don't have to worry about too much if you're going against Turbo. So if you start to see water or lightning energies, then you might be like, okay, I don't have to worry about the Sableye too much. It's going to kind of be a straightforward thing. But they can knock out a lot of your 2-prize Pokemon pretty easily, pretty fast. And that's one of the challenges. You're a little bit slower as Gardevoir, so something to keep in mind. But you also really have to protect those Curlias from that Radiant Greninja. It can get really, really dicey. But otherwise, yeah, Lost Zone decks, they're very well-known quantities or very known entities at this point, and I don't have to spend a little bit more time than I wanted to talking about them. Goodra, on the other hand, is a little bit different, mostly because of the tech cards they can put in there. Throwing in a 1/1 Vulpix line is absurd. It's something that I haven't seen done. I haven't played against it, so I don't know how it goes, but, I mean, Gardevoir can deal with Goodra just because something like the Zacian V can ramp damage super high and do a lot of damage to a Goodra. And then they throw that Vulpix in. That can throw such a wrench in your plans as the Gardevoir player if you don't know that it's something that they can do. So if you lose game 1 and you don't see that Vulpix, then game 2 comes and they just surprise you with it out of nowhere. You might not know what to do, and it might just completely derail you because you're like, oh my god, I don't even know what to do. And then you spend so much time dealing with the Vulpix that you don't deal with the Goodra. And Goodra can do 220 damage. They are often running 1, maybe even 2 belts. That means that Rolling Iron is going to be able to KO your Zacian V, which is really devastating. So keep that in mind. I'm learning this for the first time. And they even have the Articuno in there. If they're going to play the Vulpix, they have the option to throw the Articuno in, which means it does 10 more damage, and the Cramorant does 10 more damage with the Articuno. It's a very small percentage of people who are doing this. Might not even be 1 or 2 decks that play the Vulpix and the Articuno, but still, that is very scary. And this is overall, if we look at this, it's overall placement. What are the winners playing? What are the winning lists playing? I would be shocked if it was the Vulpix. No, but the winning list are playing something like the Articuno to help give Cramorant and even Greninja a little bit of extra damage. So that's something to keep in mind too. That's very interesting. Temple of Sinnoh makes sense. You only run, maybe you run V-Guard Energy, maybe, and in most situations, if it helps, cool. But man, that extra 30 damage can be the difference in knocking out a Goodra. They have 270 health, 300 effectively with the V-Guard Energy, and they take 80 less damage. That means they're doing, you have to do 380 damage to KO that thing. That's a massive amount of damage. And then they can heal all that damage. If you're just shy, you do 360 damage because Storm Slash does 10 plus 30 more for each energy. So you get 10 energies on that thing. You're doing 360. That's not enough. And if you put 10 energies on a Zacian V that has 0 energy, you're taking 200 damage, which means you can't even put an 11th energy on the thing from nothing, right? If you have 11 energies in the discard, you have to manually attach minimum 1 energy in this situation that we just crafted, because you can't put 220 damage worth of energies onto your Zacian V because it'll get KO'd, and you can't do that with Miracle, with the Psychic Embrace. So that's crazy. And yeah, wow. Articuno is interesting. Temple of Sinnoh is interesting. It doesn't really matter for you in the Gardevoir matchup, but it definitely might matter in the Mew matchup. It might matter in the Lugia matchup, especially because you want to use Duraludon or Single Strike Urshifu to knock out that Goodra. And with Temple of Sinnoh in play, you're not going to be able to do it. So luckily they're running 1 or 2, and Lugia decks are adapting by running things like Pumpkaboo. Lugia itself, while it won't do a lot of damage to the Goodra, it will get rid of the Temple, so that's good to know. Beach Court's another really common one just to help with the Comfies and get cards into the Lost Zone, but we don't really care too much about that. So yeah, something to keep in mind. We just talked about Mew Decks like the other day, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. If you want to check out what Mew Decks are doing, go check out my other video from earlier this week. However, it is worth noting, just to have an idea of what's going on with Mew. Maybe you see that Oricorio, about 1 in 3 out of 10 decks will play an Oricorio. That might change your damage calcs a little bit, but not anything I would worry about tremendously. Fan of Waves, and more importantly, Echo Horn can be really important for the deck. Lost City, again, if they're expecting Drapions, Avery's, if you're playing Lost Zone, Avery could be really problematic, especially if they Avery Path Judge or Avery Path Roxanne, and now you can't use Greninja, and you only have 2 cards, and if they're not very good, then you're not going to be able to cycle your Comfy, so that could be really problematic. They Lost City your 1 Drapion, now you can't Clara, even if you do get Roxanne miraculously into Clara, because Roxanne is a lie, you still wouldn't be able to recover the Drapion anyway, so that could be really annoying to deal with. they're going to be running choice belts. A lot of times they're running, it looks like most of them are running 3 copies of Judge, 4 copies of Path to the Peak. They obviously want to use 4 copies of Lost Vacuum because Path to the Peak turns off their Genesect. So they throw down a Path to the Peak. After turn 1, they can go ahead, Lost Vacuum a Battle VIP Pass, and then they get rid of the Path. They use their Genesect's ability to draw a bunch of cards, do all the normal Mew things, and then they just slap down another Path to keep you from using your abilities on your turn. Sure, they can't do that indefinitely. They can only do that a maximum of twice. But really, once Mew kind of sets up, if you don't have anything going, or you don't have a way to get rid of that Path to really make use of Drapion, you're kind of dead in the water, and they don't really have to draw too many cards, so they don't have to do it indefinitely, or a certain number of times. They just have to do it once or twice to really lock you out of the game and just get too far ahead for you to deal with, because if you do enough damage to Mew and don't knock it out, they could just Psychic Leap and heal all that damage by putting the Mew back into the deck, and now you're in a lot of trouble. You wasted all those turns, not able to get a KO, and they just recover the Mew, recover the energies, all that kind of stuff. So really, really annoying. Mew, I think Fusion DTE Mew is okay. It's not my favorite deck in the format, and you'll see why in just a minute. But if you are very familiar with Mew, you're really good at playing it, or maybe that's all you have, I would probably go the DTE route. Or if you are worried about Mew, then now you kind of know what to expect. The last deck we're going to take a look at the skeleton list for is Lugia V-Star. It's my deck of choice. And what's very interesting is if you look at the other common cards, Single Strike Urshifu V Max is on that list, but not Single Strike Urshifu V for some reason. But you can't use the V Max without the V, so for whatever reason, the standard list that we've been seeing is on the left. However, what some people realized is that this deck, in its current state on the left, gets completely walled by Duraludon VMAX. So people started putting Duraludon in their Lugia decks. And now if they went against the mirror, it's okay, I just have to not give up 6 prizes and throw a Duraludon in, and then they can never win, as long as I don't have 6 prizes in play. So, and honestly, you don't even need to get Archeops into play, because you can just manually attach for turn, and they can never attack you. And then once you just get a couple of energies onto that thing, then you could start swinging into all their Pokemon. So Duraludon started getting put in Lugia lists to deal with Duraludon. And I personally run Single Strike Urshifu. If you encounter a Duraludon, it's way better, because you just one-shot the Duraludon, get 3 prizes. They can't one-shot you in return. However, and it's also really good into Goodra. The Single Strike Urshifu is great against Goodra. It's great against Duraludon. It's great against just other Pokemon VMAX in general. Really bulky Pokemon V-Stars, really bulky Pokemon EXs, things like that. And Miraidon's a deck that people are going to play. There's things like the Dragonite and opposing Tyrannitars. Urshifu deals with it all. Yes, something like the Duraludon can deal with a lot of Pokemon EXs. It can deal with Miraidons. It can deal with Tyrannitars, things like that. Might get a little challenging once they can put a V-Guard energy on there, but whatever. Actually, it just ignores V-Guard anyway, so it's really not that big a deal, but whatever. The point is, Lugia decks are one of the more fluid in terms of tech cards they can put in. They can have the Single Strike Yveltal. I don't remember how much that Yveltal does off the top of my head, so I gotta look at my Lugia deck that I have right here, and it does 110 damage for 3 dark energies. But if you put 3 Single Strike energies on there, now you're doing 170, because each Single Strike energy does an additional 20 damage. So 20 times 3 is 60, plus 110 is 170. Now we're doing 170 into dark Pokemon, which means we're hitting 340 damage into or Pokemon that are dark weak. So Gardevoir EX, Mew VMAX, those are the 2 prominent ones. Maybe you'll see a Shadow Rider VMAX, something like that, turn like round 1 or 2 of a regional. Sometimes you hit those really weird rogue decks. And now that Yveltal is a really good attacking Pokemon into those VMAXs, taking huge uptrades, you're also able to just trade into something like Lost Zone decks a little bit better. You do have Duraludon to kind of help with Lost Zone decks as well, but if they run something like Dragonite, so they poke you with a Cramorant, and then they hit you with a Dragonite, and now all of a sudden your VMAX is getting KO'd and you only took 1 prize. That doesn't feel very good. So you have these 1 prize Pokemon in the form of Stonjourner, your Yveltal, Archeops to help deal with Lost Zone decks a little bit better. And then at the end of the game, you can throw up these big beefy Pokemon V-Star VMAXs to force them to take these really difficult KOs. The very last thing we're going to talk about is the meta share. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because 1, this video is getting a little long as is, and 2, really all you have to do is pause the video and look at your deck list or the deck you want to play and see how it does against other things. So for example, I'll show you how to read it. Let's say I want to play Lugia Archeops, right, which is down here 3rd from the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at Lugia's matchups, see what it does well against and what it does poorly against, and compare that to the meta, how often those things are being played. So it does poorly against Arceus Duraludon. Now, this is, remember, not all the Lugia decks are playing something like Single Strike Urshifu, so I know my build is going to actually do better than 33%, but, you know, whatever. So it does kind of poorly. It's a little unfavored into something like Arceus Flying Pikachu, but it's not very popular, so I don't care. We're actually a little bit unfavored into something like Arceus Giratina. Again, not very popular, so I don't care too much. Gardevoir, we're a little unfavored. That makes a kind of sense. It's one of those things that because Gardevoir is very, very popular, I would probably add in at least 1 of those Single Strike Yveltals, give us something to uptrade into, but that's just me. We don't do well against Giratina Lost Box. We struggle against Goodra Lost Box. Again, if you're running the Single Strike Urshifu, your matchup spread is going to be a little bit better into something like Goodra. And then the rest of the decks we're either doing really well against or we're favored. We do really well against Urshifu and Teleon, but again, not really playing that much, so I don't care. We beat Miraidon. We're a little unfavored into Mew. Okay, whatever. That's a mirror. And then Lost Zone Box, Sablezard, we're a little favored and neutral. You know, so we don't have the greatest matchup spread, if I'm being super honest. Most of the stuff we're like slightly unfavored against, but we can change that matchup data based on the text we play. And that's one of the things that makes Lugia actually pretty good, is that we can kind of constantly adapt to the meta. We already do pretty good against Lost Zone decks and Sablezard, so now if I add extra single prize Pokemon, that only makes that matchup that much better. And it also helps the Mew and Gardevoir matchup, so that 1 tech card of the Single Strike Yveltal improves matchups, like 4 different matchups, and the Single Strike Urshifu also improves 2 different or even 3 different matchups, if I'm being honest. The Arceus Duraludon, the Arceus Flying Pikachu, and the Goodra Lost Zone decks. And if we're going against like an Arceus Goodra deck, it improves that matchup as well. So that's the kind of thing I just wanted to highlight one particular deck on this and talk very, very briefly about tech cards. When you're choosing a tech card, me personally, I would choose a tech card that is better against, let's say you have a tech card that is really, like, 10 out of 10 powerful against one deck, but against all the other decks, it doesn't do anything. And then you have another tech card that's like a 7 out of 10 in terms of, against one deck, but it's still useful. Maybe it's like a 5 out of 10 with all the other decks. I would take that one, because now I don't have this dead, absolutely totally dead card in my hand against most of the decks that I'm playing against. I would take the one that it might be a little less powerful, but it still has use in at least a few other matchups. And that's why I really like that Single Strike Yveltal. I actually just bought a few and they came in today, so I was very happy about that. I have them for the weekend. But yeah, take a moment, pause this, or just go to Trainer Hill and check out the matchup data for yourself. But yeah, why don't we wrap this up? That's going to do it for us today. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, found it informative. If you did, let me know in the comments. What deck are you thinking about for a League Challenge? What have you been playing lately? Are you changing decks? Are you changing strategies? I like to talk all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's going to do it for us today. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.